Imagine you've got this planetary heart monitor,
Okay.
and it has been running uninterrupted for 100 years, just tracking every single heartbeat of the American wilderness.
Right.
It captures every subtle shift in the baseline rhythm, every irregular palpitation, every tiny anomaly that might signal, a massive systemic crisis down the
Yeah,
road.
the vital signs.
Exactly. And you rely entirely on that unbroken line on the screen to understand what healthy even looks like. But now imagine someone walking into that hospital room, looking at the blinking lights and just yanking the plug out of the wall to save on the electric bill.
It's a terrifying thought.
It is. And today, we are taking a deep dive into a live and unfolding crisis that is basically doing exactly that. We're looking at the fundamental restructuring, and some argue the total dismantling of the United States Forest Service Research and Development Network.
Yeah, because when you unplug a machine like that, the true danger isn't just the few hours of data you miss while the screen is dark.
Right.
The danger is the complete loss of context. I mean, in science, when you sever a continuous monitoring line, you don't just pause the record. You break the fundamental continuity that makes the data mean anything at all.
And we have compiled a massive dossier for you today to really unpack this. We are pulling from reporting straight through June 2026, official government budgets, historical documents stretching back over a century, and even some firsthand accounts.
It's a lot of material to go through.
It is. But our mission is to understand the physical, the legal, and the scientific realities of what happens when the government decides to just, stop measuring the natural world.
Yeah.
But to do that, we have to establish a core concept first. We have to talk about something called a time series.
Right. So a time series. This is really the foundational premise of ecological science. It's simply a sequence of data points measured at successive uniform intervals over time.
Okay.
And in forest ecology, I mean, a time series is everything. It is quite literally the only way we know if a forest is growing or dying or drying out or subtly changing its fundamental chemical composition.
Because you need that long view.
Exactly. And what is absolutely crucial to grasp up front here is that when a century-long forest data series stops, it does not hit a pause button.
It ends.
It ends completely. If you stop measuring a watershed for 5 years and then start again, when budgets improve, you haven't resumed a 100-year data set.
Wow. Okay.
You have started a brand new day one data set. The historical continuity is permanently, irreversibly severed.
Let me make sure I am visualizing this correctly. You're saying that the value of the data isn't just the individual measurement taken today.
Right.
The value is the unbroken relationship between today's measurement and the measurement taken on this exact day in, 1935.
Think of it like trying to read a novel where someone has just ripped out chapters 4 through 9.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, you might still be able to read chapter 10, but the character motivations, the plot development, the underlying logic of the story, all of that is lost. And in ecology, the slow changes are often the most important ones to track.
Like climate shifts.
Right. A slight drop in soil moisture over 50 years might tell you a mega drought is coming. But if you only have a 3-year snapshot, that drop just looks like a random fluctuation. You absolutely need the deep time series to separate the noise from the signal.
So to understand why scientists are categorizing this 2025 to 2026 restructuring as an irreversible event, we need to look at the sheer physical scale of the cuts happening on the ground right now. Because the numbers in our dossier are, frankly, they're hard to wrap your head around.
They really are. Let's lay out the stark reality of the current timeline here. We are looking at a massive, incredibly rapid loss of staffing across the agency.
How massive are we talking?
Roughly 5,900 employees have departed.
5,900.
Yes, through a combination of buyouts, early retirements, deferred resignation offers, and direct reductions. To put that in perspective, that represents about 16% of the entire Forest Service workforce.
That is nearly 1 in 6 people suddenly gone.
Just gone.
And what stands out to me in these reports is that this isn't just, general administrative staff trimming. The bleed is happening in highly specialized knowledge bases. We're losing the people who actually know how the forest works.
Oh, the cuts among the scientists are remarkably sharp, especially at the highest echelons of expertise. Let's just look at the STEM PhDs for a second.
Okay, let's look at them.
Out of 633 STEM PhDs employed by the agency in December 2024,
Right.
nadas of 137 had left by December 2025.
Wow.
That is more than a fifth of their top-tier scientific minds departing within a single 12-month window. Reporting indicates this is the third largest percentage loss among all federal research agencies.
That is staggering.
Jeffrey Donovan, a departing economist from the Pacific Northwest Research Station who had been there for over 2 decades, he was quoted in the reporting calling this massive loss of institutional capacity simply heartbreaking.
I really want to dig into that concept of institutional capacity.
Mhm.
Because when you lose a PhD who has spent 20 years studying the exact microclimate, the soil hydrology, the insect populations of a specific mountain range, you don't just lose an employee on a payroll sheet.
No, absolutely not.
You lose the entire mental map of that ecosystem.
Yeah.
You lose the person who knows that a certain stream always runs dry right before a bad fire season, or the person who knows how a specific species of pine reacts to a 2-degree temperature bump.
Exactly.
You can't just hire a new grad student and expect them to immediately download 20 years of instinct and localized observation.
You are losing the human equivalent of the time series. And the physical footprint of American forestry science is shrinking just as drastically as the personnel. The facility closures are sweeping and methodical.
Our real estate.
Plans indicate that at least 57 of the 77 research facilities scattered across 31 states are slated to close.
57 out of 77.
Yeah. And some internal reports leaked in June 2026 suggest more than 100 facilities across the broader agency structure are actually under evaluation for closure or consolidation.
And these aren't just generic office parks we are talking about. The dossier lists named deeply historic sites.
Historic is the word for it.
Like the Bartlett Experimental Forest in New Hampshire is on the closure list. That site was established back in 1931. It covers nearly 6,000 acres of the White Mountains.
Yeah, almost a century of data.
They are closing research stations in Ohio. 4 distinct facilities in Pennsylvania are on the block. Sites in South Carolina tied to the Francis Marion National Forest in Clemson University.
It's a geographic retreat.
They are systematically shutting down the regional offices, and the 5 massive regional research stations are being consolidated into a single, leaner entity headquartered in Fort Collins, Colorado.
And the mechanics of closing a facility like Bartlett are profound. It is not just, locking a front door.
Right, it's not a retail store.
It involves shutting down continuous monitoring equipment, abandoning test plots that have been carefully managed and observed for decades, and severing the deep partnerships these stations have built with local universities and state forestry departments. It is the physical withdrawal of federal science from the regional landscape.
Okay, here is where I have to play devil's advocate for a second. Because I am looking at the financial reporting in our dossier, and I'm genuinely struggling to understand the mechanics of this.
Sure, lay it out.
The fiscal year 2027 budget justification, which was released in April 2026, it requests an incredibly specific number for forest and rangeland research. It requests exactly $0.
Right.
0. Down from roughly $309 million the previous year. Now wait. How does a massive federal agency physically operate an R&D department, even a consolidated one in Fort Collins, on a literal $0 budget? Is this a typo? Is it some kind of bureaucratic accounting trick? Because you cannot run a national research hub on $0.
I know, it sounds impossible, but it requires understanding the highly specific mechanics of federal appropriations. When an agency submits a budget justification requesting $0 for a specific program, it is not a typo and it is not a pause.
Okay, then what is it?
It is a mandated wind down. The budget language in the dossier explicitly frames this using a bureaucratic mechanism called carryover balances.
Carryover balances.
Yeah.
Meaning the money they didn't spend last year?
Unspent funds from previous fiscal years, yes. But the critical detail is how they are instructed to use those leftover funds.
Right.
The budget directive does not say use carryover balances to continue the research. It explicitly instructs the agency to use those funds to responsibly terminate programs.
Let's responsibly terminate. So the only money the science division has left is purely severance pay for the science itself.
Yes, exactly.
It is the cost of buying cardboard boxes, paying the final utility bills, processing the early retirement paperwork, and locking the gates.
The stated intent in the $0 budget justification is to permanently close the stations and offload the ongoing research responsibilities onto universities and the private sector.
Offloading it.
The $0 is a bright flashing sign that the federal government is stepping entirely out of the business of funding this specific type of internal, long-term ecological research. The consolidated hub in Fort Collins will essentially manage the transition and perhaps oversee heavily outsourced, highly specific short-term management requests. But the era of broad, federally funded forest science is being zeroed out.
This massive systemic shift isn't happening in a vacuum, though. It is being driven by a very specific, deliberate administrative philosophy about what the government should and shouldn't be doing.
That's right.
And I want to make sure we are incredibly clear here for you listening. We are looking at this dossier strictly as a documentary exercise. We are laying out the blueprint of a live, highly contested debate. We need to examine the administration's stated goals on their own terms.
Absolutely. The driving forces behind this restructuring are the Secretary of Agriculture, Brooke Rollins, and the Forest Service Chief, Tom Schultz.
Okay.
Their stated rationale, repeated across multiple press releases and congressional testimonies, is that this process is not a destruction, but a necessary transformation.
Right, transformation.
Yeah.
The key words popping up in all the official documents are cost-cutting, efficiency, and ending administrative duplication. Secretary Rollins framed this entire restructuring as a move toward common-sense forest management.
And if we look at the immense financial pressure the agency is under, the administration's argument actually has a clear internal logic to it.
Walk us through that logic.
Well, the Forest Service has been running severe operational deficits for years, driven almost entirely by the astronomical, skyrocketing costs of modern firefighting.
Because the fires are getting worse.
Exactly. As fire seasons grow longer and more destructive, fire suppression eats a larger and larger percentage of the agency's total pie. The administration is looking at that reality and deciding they can no longer afford to fund scattered, long-term ecological research priorities when the literal forests are burning down and bankrupting them.
They want to stop studying the forest and start aggressively managing it.
Yes.
And the plan involves moving the agency headquarters out of Washington, D.C. and relocating it to Salt Lake City, Utah. The argument there is that they are putting the top leadership physically closer to the vast western national forests they actually manage, rather than having them sit in offices on the East Coast.
And by consolidating the remaining shrunken research apparatus into that single hub in Fort Collins, Colorado, they argue they can accelerate the application of science directly to on-the-ground management.
Making it more applied.
Right. They want research that immediately serves the people holding the chainsaws and driving the bulldozers today, not research that might be useful for a climate model in 50 years.
It is a massive pivot in the agency's core historical mission. The documents explicitly detail a shift toward boosting domestic timber production and lowering material costs for consumers.
Yeah, an extraction focus.
They are intentionally favoring an extraction and management mission over the broader ecological research mission that the agency has tried to balance for the last century.
And this ties directly back to the $0 budget and that offloading premise we mentioned. The official line from the administration is that the government should only perform the most decision-relevant, immediate, applied research.
And everything else.
Everything else, the long-term monitoring, the broad ecological baseline studies, the tracking of slow climate variables, is viewed as something that universities and private enterprise can and should pick up. The administration fundamentally believes that private entities are better suited, more agile, and more financially efficient at handling the deep research the government is abandoning.
Let me try to put an analogy on this offloading premise. Imagine a major tech company that has funded this legendary experimental moonshot lab for decades.
Okay, I like this.
This lab just invents wild things without worrying about immediate quarterly profits. They invented the computer mouse, or the graphical interface, just by playing around with long-term ideas. But suddenly the company's core product isn't selling as well, and their server costs are going through the roof.
The budget gets tight.
Right. So the CEO shuts down the moonshot lab, fires the experimental engineers, and says, "We are focusing purely on selling our core software now. If we need a brilliant new invention in 10 years, we will just buy it from a university or a scrappy startup."
Yeah.
They are banking entirely on the assumption that the outside world will keep doing the deep, unprofitable R&D for them for free.
That captures the administration's philosophy perfectly. They are treating the Forest Service's century-old ecological time series like a corporate R&D lab that can just be outsourced to protect the bottom line.
But treating an ecological baseline like a corporate tech lab has triggered a massive immediate backlash. Critics are arguing that those two environments, the corporate tech world and the natural ecological world, operate under fundamentally different laws of physics and finance.
The pushback against this restructuring plan has been intense. It's highly organized, and it is coming from multiple powerful directions. We are looking at a bipartisan coalition of lawmakers mobilizing against the administration.
Yeah, the dossier outlines a massive coalition.
Led by prominent figures like Senator Martin Heinrich, who provided the rallying cry for the critics when he explicitly called this plan a roadmap to dismantle.
So we have transformation and efficiency on one side and a roadmap to dismantle on the other. Let's look at the three main pillars of the critics' objections. Again, reporting this strictly from the mechanisms outlined in our dossier. Because if they are bulldozing past Congress to execute this plan, the immediate question becomes, how is this even legal?
Right.
And that is the first major objection. Sheer legality.
The legal argument is fascinating and highly contentious. According to the reporting, the fiscal year 2026 appropriations law contains highly specific, legally binding language.
Huh?
It bars the agency from spending any money to relocate offices or employees or to initiate any major reorganization without getting prior explicit approval from the Congressional Appropriations Committees.
Let's get into the mechanics of that. The legislative branch, Congress, controls the power of the purse. They wrote a law saying you cannot use our money to move your people or close your labs unless you ask us first. But the Forest Service is moving ahead anyway.
They are acting in direct defiance of that committee approval process. Chief Tom Schultz testified that the reorganization plan was thoroughly reviewed and legally cleared by the USDA's Office of General Counsel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The executive agency has signaled it intends to proceed with the relocations, the buyouts, and the closures with or without congressional committee approval.
This raises a wild logistical question for me. If it is potentially illegal under the appropriations law to spend money to move these offices, how is the agency physically printing, stamping, and mailing out 6,000 relocation and reassignment letters to employees? Who wins in a standoff between an executive agency's general counsel and the Congressional Appropriations Committee?
This is a constitutional stress test happening in real time over forest management. And there is no immediate clear answer to who wins. Right now, the executive branch is aggressively asserting its inherent authority to manage its own departments and personnel, arguing that internal reorganization doesn't require congressional micromanagement.
While Congress says, hey, that's our money.
Exactly. The legislative branch is asserting its absolute constitutional power over how federal dollars are spent. Lawmakers are openly warning that this violates federal budget law, and the federal employee unions have pledged to fight the move simultaneously in the halls of Congress and in the federal courts.
So it's headed for a legal freeze.
It is highly likely this entire process will be temporarily frozen by injunctions as it works its way through the judiciary.
Okay, so legality is pillar one. The second pillar of the critics' argument attacks that offloading premise we talked about earlier. The administration's assumption that universities and private companies will simply take over the deep research.
Critics argue this is a fundamental, fatal flaw in the administration's financial logic. Because remember the time series we talked about?
The century-long baseline.
Right. Handing long-term monitoring over to universities and private industry assumes that someone else will voluntarily fund and sustain century-scale, non-commercial baselines. But historically, this is a public good function that private actors almost never take on.
Because the mechanics of capitalism don't reward it. The financial payoff is way too slow and too diffuse.
Exactly. Consider a private timber company. They want research on how to grow a specific species of pine tree 10% faster over the next 20 years so they can harvest it sooner.
Right, applied research.
They will gladly fund that applied research. But they are absolutely not going to fund a 100-year study on the slow degradation of soil hydrology in a non-commercial watershed that they don't even own. There is no return on investment for them.
And what about the universities? Can't they pick up the slack? I mean, they do a lot of research.
Universities run on grant cycles, and the mechanics of academic funding dictate that a researcher applies for a grant, gets funding for 3 to 5 years, publishes a paper, and then has to scramble for the next grant.
You can't run a 100-year project on 3-year grants.
You cannot sustain a 100-year continuous monitoring project on 3-year grant cycles. The moment a grant isn't renewed, the time series is broken.
The camera turns off.
Right. The critics argue forcefully that if the federal government doesn't fund the long-term baseline, the baseline simply dies. No one else has the mandate, the patience, or the guaranteed century-long funding structure to do it.
Which brings us to the third pillar of the criticism, which is the timing. And this is where the abstract policy debate in Washington hits the physical reality of the American landscape.
The timing is incredibly alarming to observers on the ground. We are currently in the middle of an actively worsening severe fire season across the West.
And right as the landscape is drying out, right as the megafires are spinning up, the agency is hollowing out its field capacity. The reporting in the dossier cites a staggering statistic. Forest thinning and prescribed firework has dropped by roughly 38%.
A 38% drop.
A 38% drop in fire prevention work right when fires are getting worse. Let's explain the mechanics of that work for a second. Prescribed fire isn't just, walking into the woods with a drip torch and hoping for the best.
No, it's highly technical.
It requires immense localized knowledge. You need to know exactly how dry the underbrush is, what the local wind patterns are going to do at 2:00 p.m., and how the specific topography of a canyon will channel the heat. You need the exact people the agency is currently losing.
The critics argue that losing the personnel who understand the local fire ecology, the people who actually plan and execute the prescribed burns, is the exact opposite of the efficiency the administration is claiming.
You save money today, but
But by dropping your preventative thinning by 38%, you are virtually guaranteeing billions of dollars in catastrophic fire damage tomorrow.
So on one hand, we have an administration predicting a leaner, more focused, cheaper agency that gets timber to market faster. On the other hand, critics are predicting a dismantled agency, stripped of its experts, legally embattled, and incapable of fulfilling its basic scientific or protective duties.
The honest reading of our dossier is that reorganization and dismantling aren't mutually exclusive labels. They are competing predictions about what will actually survive this incredibly messy process of zeroed-out budgets, carryover balances, and court battles.
But to really understand who is right in that debate, to understand the true cost of this restructuring, we have to look closer at the actual science being cut. Because the nature of this specific kind of data makes the debate entirely unforgiving. Once it is gone, it cannot be legislated back into existence. Let's delve into the methodological catastrophe. Let's talk about why year zero is permanent.
This is where the loss transcends politics and bureaucracy and becomes a purely scientific tragedy. The experimental forests and ranges managed by the Forest Service are unique on a global scale.
How so?
Their entire methodological value is based on holding one single variable perfectly steady for generations. That variable is the exact same place on the Earth.
They just go back to the same patch of dirt, the same stream, the same stand of trees, year after year, decade after decade.
By holding the geographic place completely steady, any changes they measure over time can be read with incredible crystalline clarity. It removes the environmental noise. Let me give you the most famous example from the dossier, one that profoundly changed environmental policy. Acid rain.
Oh, okay. How did we actually discover acid rain? Because I know it wasn't through a short-term, 3-year corporate study.
No, it was discovered at the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire. And the mechanics of how they found it are crucial. At Hubbard Brook, scientists had built these concrete V-notch weirs across the streams in the watershed.
Like little dams.
Yeah, exactly. And every single day, they measured the exact volume of water flowing out of the forest, and they took samples to measure the exact chemical composition of the water and the rain falling into the forest. They did this for years, building up a massive baseline of what the normal chemistry of the rain was supposed to be.
So when the pH levels started to drop, when the rain started becoming unnaturally acidic due to industrial pollution from the Midwest, they noticed it immediately.
They only noticed the anomaly because they had the baseline. If they had just walked into the forest in 1970 and taken a water sample, they would have known the water was acidic, but they wouldn't have known if it had always been acidic, or if it was a new phenomenon.
Right, without the baseline, the anomaly is invisible.
If you don't know what normal is, you can't identify a crisis until it has become a full-blown catastrophe.
And Hubbard Brook isn't even the oldest site. The dossier lists the Santa Rita and the Great Basin Range stations. They have continuous records of forage growth and soil erosion stretching back 110 to 120 years.
Over a century.
The Bartlett Experimental Forest dates back to 1931. The Prairie State's shelter belts are living, century-class plots tracking how windbreaks affect agricultural ecology.
The permanence of this loss is what critics are desperately trying to communicate. You cannot retroactively measure 1931.
I want to use an analogy here to make sure the permanence of this loss is crystal clear. Think of these century-long baselines not like a digital file on your computer. If you accidentally delete a Word document, you can usually pull it out of the trash bin or download it from your cloud backup. It's safe. But this data isn't a digital file. It is a physical time-lapse camera. Imagine a camera set up on a sturdy tripod in the middle of a forest, and it has been snapping one single photo every single day for 100 years. It captures the saplings growing, the snows falling, the fires burning, the slow, subtle shift of the climate.
I can picture it.
Now imagine the government walks in, turns off that camera for 5 years to save money, and then later decides, okay, we have the budget again, turn it back on. The time lapse is broken forever. You don't get a 105-year continuous record with a little 5-year gap. The mathematical continuity is shattered. You get a brand new 1-year record. You're back at year 0.
That time-lapse camera is the perfect way to understand it, because you cannot accurately reconstruct a 50-year continuous record of soil hydrology or tree growth from a computer model later on.
The models need the data.
The models themselves require the physical baseline data to know if their predictions are accurate. If we extrapolate this to modern science, the implications of breaking that camera are vast. Think about the most pressing, complex environmental questions we face today. Predictive models for catastrophic wildfire behavior.
So you juice you.
Understanding the mechanics of mega droughts in the West. Tracking the spread of invasive insect and disease outbreaks. The entire burgeoning field of climate attribution science. Every single one of these disciplines relies on continuous, unbroken historical data to function.
They need to know exactly what the forest did 50 years ago under specific conditions to even begin to guess what it will do tomorrow under new conditions.
By cutting this long-term research now, during an era of intensifying wildfires and rapid climate shift, we are actively removing the fundamental measurement infrastructure at the exact moment the scientific questions are becoming the hardest to answer. We are flying a plane blind into a massive storm, and the administration just threw the radar out the window to make the plane slightly lighter.
That is the tragedy of the data, the loss of the numbers, the broken time-lapse camera. But, reading through all these high-level budget memos, the facility closure lists, the satellite modeling reports, it is so easy to just see spreadsheets. It's easy to get lost in the macro-level bureaucracy of it all.
It really is.
But the thing in this dossier that actually stopped me in my track, the thing that made me realize the true scale of what is being zeroed out, was a personal account tucked into the back. Because the guy who compiled this dossier, a man named Nick McKenzie, his story is actually my story.
Oh, wow.
The timeline, the locations, the specific science, it mirrors my own life in a way that I couldn't ignore.
Yeah.
To truly explain what is being lost here, to understand the hidden costs of closing these facilities, I need to take you back to 1976.
This is a profound shift in perspective. Moving from the grand scale of century-long data sets and federal appropriations law down to a single summer job in a regional lab.
It is 1976. I am a young guy, and I am waiting to start medical school. I have about 18 months to kill, and I need a job to pay the bills. So I drive out to Moscow, Idaho. I walk into the Forest Service research lab there, literally just knocking on doors and asking around for temp work.
Let's walk straight in.
Just walked in. I had some vague idea that I wanted to work on a forest growth simulation project. The unit I walked into was run by a brilliant scientist named Albert Stage.
Oh, Albert Stage is a legendary figure in modern forestry. He pioneered the integration of deep statistical analysis with forest management.
He really is. But at the time, to a kid looking for a paycheck, he was just the guy running the lab. Now, they didn't have a cozy indoor modeling job open for a temp, but what they did have was a chainsaw. There was a new intensive study starting up under another scientist, Robert Monserud. They were looking into how a massive outbreak of the Douglas fir tussock moth was affecting tree growth. They needed someone to do the grunt work. They needed someone to go collect the ground truth.
Gathering ground truth data is the hardest, most unglamorous part of the scientific process.
Gritty doesn't even begin to cover it. The work was called destructive sampling. My job was to go out into the stands of timber, run the chainsaw, and fell the fir trees. Then I had to do stem analysis, which basically means I wasn't just chopping wood, I was reading the tree's diary.
Ring by ring.
We would cut these cross-sections, these cookies, out of the truck at specific intervals. I had to count and measure the rings. A wide, healthy ring meant a good year with plenty of rain. A pinched, microscopic ring showed exactly the year the tussock moth stripped the needles from the canopy and the trees starved.
Fascinating.
I was physically measuring the geometry of a bug infestation, reconstructing the growth history of each individual tree, ring by painstaking ring. I spent 6 months in the fall of 1976, covered in sawdust and bar oil, just building the raw data set that would eventually feed into Stages and Monserud's computer models.
To provide the historical weight to what you were unwittingly building out there in the sawdust, that data mattered far beyond that single season in Idaho.
How so?
Albert Stage had built something called the prognosis model for stand development back in 1973. It was originally just a regional tool for northern Idaho and western Montana. But fueled by the kind of meticulous, localized ground data you were collecting, that model evolved. It grew far beyond its regional origins. It eventually became the Forest Vegetation Simulator, or FVS. By the early 1980s, the FVS was adopted as the Forest Service's absolute national standard for forest growth and yield modeling.
It is wild to think about the trajectory of that data.
It is used worldwide today. It is the gold standard. The grueling data work you did as a temp sat at the very origin point of a landmark tool in global forestry.
But here's the critical thing I really want you to focus on. As proud as I am to have swung a chainsaw for that project, I wasn't a career forester. I wasn't going to stay in the Forest Service and dedicate my life to silviculture. I was a kid passing through on his way to medical school. That temporary intersection between me and a federal research lab created an invisible dividend, a dividend that the government never tracked, never measured, and never took credit for in any budget justification. But that ended up changing countless lives decades later.
This is the concept of the hidden human pipeline, the true value generated by these research stations that never ever appears on a congressional balance sheet.
The true dividend of that temp job in Moscow, Idaho, wasn't the tree data. It was that the job, in order to process all those thousands of tree rings, taught me how to program computers.
Oh, wow.
I learned to code purely because I had to figure out how to manage and sort the massive amounts of tussock moth data we were generating.
That single technical skill, acquired out of sheer necessity in a forestry lab, created a massive, entirely unexpected ripple effect in a completely different professional field.
It changed the trajectory of my life and the lives of people I would never meet. I used that new programming skill to do consulting work on the side, which is how I paid my way through medical school. But it goes so much deeper than just paying tuition.
What happened next?
Fast forward years later. I am in my anesthesia residency. My wife is a pediatric resident. She is working in the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU. And every single day, she was coming home exhausted, terrified, and stressed out of her mind because she had to manually calculate the custom intravenous nutrition formulas called TPN, total parenteral nutrition for premature newborns.
Oh, the mechanics of calculating TPN for neonates are incredibly complex, and the stakes are literally life and death.
You are dealing with tiny, fragile infants weighing sometimes less than 2 pounds. Their weight fluctuates daily. You have to manually calculate the exact ratios of dextrose, amino acids, lipids, and highly specific electrolytes based on their changing weight in grams.
Doing that by hand.
Manual calculation for these fragile infants is notoriously brutal and highly prone to human error. A misplaced decimal point on a potassium calculation can be fatal. It was a terrifying daily burden for the doctors.
So what did you do?
So I looked at her problem, and I realized it wasn't a medical problem. It was a math and logic problem. The exact same kind of logic problem I used to organize tree ring data and model insect defoliation.
That's incredible.
I sat down and used the exact coding skills I learned at the Forest Service lab in 1976 to write a computer program. I automated the entire TPN calculation process for the premature babies, removing the human math errors entirely.
The lifespan of that software solution is astounding when you consider its origins.
That program I wrote ran for 42 years. It was used across major children's hospitals. It calculated the exact life-saving nutrition for countless premature infants. Infants who survived, who grew up, who lived their entire life without ever knowing what a Douglas fir tussock moth was. Infants whose survival was directly, causally linked to a federal budget that paid a kid to run a chainsaw in Idaho. So I have a very serious question for the people submitting the $0 budget justification today. How do you capture that in a federal appropriation spreadsheet? When you request $0 and celebrate your newfound efficiency in cost-cutting, how do you account for the 42 years of premature babies who survived because a 1976 forestry lab needed someone to gather ground truth?
You simply cannot capture it, and that is the ultimate hidden tragedy of dismantling this network. It is the catastrophic loss of human potential. When the government evaluates these research stations to see if they are worth keeping open, they only score them on their declared highly specific outputs. They count the board feet of timber they measure, they look at the fire spread models they produce, they look at the growth curves.
But they miss the people.
But what your story so vividly proves is that these facilities are secretly engines of human capital. They take in students, temporary workers, locals, people just passing through. They hand these young people real, complex, messy scientific problems. They give them real tools. They teach them rigorous methodology, how to look at data, how to solve a problem that has never been solved before. And then they launch them back out into the wider economy.
And they take those skills everywhere.
Those people go on to create massive life-saving value in fields the agency never claims. Medical software, aerospace engineering, local education, advanced climate science. That value is completely invisible to the administrators zeroing out the budget today, precisely because it never appeared in any budget to begin with.
By defunding the research, by locking the doors on the Bartlett experimental forest, by firing the PhDs and scattering the teams, we aren't just severing the historical data timeline. We are quietly severing the human pipeline. We are shutting down the classroom where the next generation was inadvertently learning how to solve the world's hardest problems.
This raises a fundamental question about what we actually consider valuable as a society. Efficiency is a highly useful metric if you are running a factory producing widgets. It is a terrible, destructive metric if you're running a laboratory. Scientific discovery, by its very nature, is inherently inefficient.
It's messy.
It requires time, vast amounts of patience, stability, and a high tolerance for unexpected, weird outcomes.
Which brings us back to the overarching theme of this entire deep dive: ground truth. The idea that going out to the physical ground, standing in the dirt, running the chainsaw, measuring the water in the weir, and verifying what the computer models and the satellites are only guessing at, that is a profound form of truth. It is incredibly hard, slow, and expensive to build that kind of truth, but it is terrifyingly fast and cheap to destroy it.
The continuous measurement of the landscape, the stable baselines that stretch back a century to 1931, and the hidden pipeline of people trained to take those measurements, they are all the exact same kind of vital, irreplaceable asset. They take 100 years of unbroken, patient, quiet commitment to build, and they take exactly one single budget cycle to erase forever.
We started this conversation by imagining a patient hooked up to a planetary heart monitor. We asked what happens when someone unplugs that machine to save a few bucks on the electricity bill. The answer is you lose the patient's medical history, and worse, you lose the young doctors who are learning how to read the screen in the first place. So, as we watch the dismantling of century-old public science infrastructures in the name of immediate financial efficiency, as we assume that the private sector will simply buy the answers we need later, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to mull over. What other invisible pipelines of human innovation, the ones we unknowingly rely on for our very survival, are we quietly severing right now, simply because their true value didn't fit neatly into this year's budget spreadsheet? This deep dive was custom-tailored for you. Thank you for listening.